So when did you first discover your interest in trust in journalism?
Oh, it's probably when I first started working in journalism, which would be my very, I mean, I don't know, it's probably, I can't pinpoint it, but yeah, it was probably from my earliest days as a journalist when I realized that journalism isn't journalism unless it's trustworthy and unless you have the trust of your audience and your public and the sources as well.
And why was the Trust Project formed?
Well, I formed it because that was in about end of 2014, and I had held a couple of, have always in my career been involved in bringing people together and having kind of working with others to have a more, maybe hold journalism to its highest values and find ways to do that. And so I'd had something early on in my career where or maybe I wouldn't say early in my career, but around late 1990s, where I brought together some senior news executives around the Bay Area that were moving into the digital environment. By that, I mean San Francisco Bay Area, talking about ethics in that space. It was I was president of the Society of Professional Journalists in Northern California. And then when I had a endowed chair at university, it was a 5-year appointment. I wanted to revive that group and just see how things had changed and see how we should, what needed to be done, and how could we solve this problem, because I knew it still existed, that trust had still been declining in the intervening years. And what surprised me was everybody was still talking about the same problems and they were describing it in the same way. So it was as if nothing had changed, and as news had moved into the digital space, it was as if editors felt they were captive to this space and that there was nothing they could do to uphold the best standards of journalism. That basically the complaint was, well, our standards are degrading, our ethics are degrading, and there's not a lot we can do about it because we're in competition with all this other kind of information that looks like news. And so we've got to get the clicks, we've got to get our metrics up. And so I thought, well, that doesn't make sense. Why are we letting this environment define journalism for us? And as a result, trust is declining in journalism. So why can't we flip the picture and make journalism and use this technology to surface or to highlight and support better journalism? So that was the start of the Trust Project.
And then I just had one question, because you've referred to it as a consortium. Is it a blockchain consortium, or is that just a?
No, we're not.
Use the term consortium.
Yeah, so I call it a consortium or a consortium or a network because we work collaboratively. So we are an entity. We're a nonprofit California organization. We just filed for a 501c3 approval, which means that we'd be like an official U.S. nonprofit. So we'll hear back from the tax entity, the tax agency, the IRS, sometime in the next year. But we operate, everything we do is collaborative. So the way we designed and defined the trust indicators was we went out and we used user-centered research. I don't know if you're familiar with user-centered design, which really involves going out and talking with people and designing around what people need and want, like learning their needs and wants. So we went out and asked people, what do they value in the news? When do they trust it? When don't they? How do they decide? And then we had meetings with news executives, and they were workshops where we brought together people and brought this research to them and said, okay, this is what we're learning from the public. How can we respond to this and design something that represents journalistic values and telegraphs them essentially in a way that people find resonates with people and meets their needs too. And so that was precisely the way this idea of the trust indicators came out, that okay, we're going to show things on the pages. And then in response to my original problem, we will also create markup so that in schema.org is the vocabulary we use, but we'll create markup so that the technology platforms will also be able to differentiate real journalism from everything else. So it's the users and the platforms. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at doing the same thing, like using claim review. So
okay, yeah, that makes
in combination
sense.
with okay. So what specific insights did your research reveal?
Well, a lot. And we just did some new research this last summer, which we haven't published results, but we will, I don't know, maybe in the next month sometime. We have to put it together into a report. We've started talking about it publicly, but we haven't done the report. So, I mean, basically the 8 trust indicators reflect the core findings because, and I could go through them, but basically people were, and this hasn't changed. People assume that news has an agenda because everybody has one, even though journalists try to be unbiased. This is the feeling. And so they wanted news or journalists to explain what their agenda is. And so we have the best practices trust indicator, which explains that, I mean, it helps people see that our agenda is to serve the public. And you can see what are the constraints and the guidelines that keep journalists within that public service mission and how we can avoid conflict of interest. What do we do about, how are we responsive to the public when the public has concerns or when we need to make a correction? So that's one trust indicator. It's called best practices. They wanted to know more about who the journalist was. And they're like, why should I trust this person? So we have a journalist expertise or information trust indicator. And there was lots of things that are embedded in that have to do with what people were looking for, including what language does this journalist speak. And then people felt that news was blending with opinion, which it clearly was, and in some ways still is. I think we're doing a little bit better job now, but so labeling. So that's what we do now. All of our sites label news versus opinion versus other kinds of journalism. And all of our news partners share the same definition. So if you go onto a Trust Project News Partner site, you'll, like the Washington Post or in Canada, CTV News or the National Observer of Canada or the Walrus, you'll see a label that says this is opinion or sometimes news, although that's assumed to be the default, or investigative, and then there'll be a little definition, and you should see pretty close to the same definition everywhere. And then another important one was diverse voices, because people felt like they were hearing just from people at high levels of business and government. So they wanted to learn more about others and also see more of themselves in the news. So we have both of those things, and so news is expected to be representative, and it's also expected to help us understand one another. And to me, that's really important because it's a crucial role of news. And I was interested to see that the public really understands that and values it. And in our most recent research, that came up again, and including maybe even especially now around ideology, but also about identity. And there's like 3 or 4 others, but that's the idea. Like each of the 8 responds to a core user need, and then or way of evaluating news. And now what we found was those trust indicators hold up. We've had done research in the interim that showed that they are effective, and that in an A/B study, we get a statistically significant difference in value of the credibility of the site and also the credibility of the journalist. And most recently, there was a lot of interest or concerns raised of, let's just say, expression around emotion. That news is has a lot of emotional content for people right now across various dimensions. So one dimension is just there is emotional content to it. You know, people dying around the world from the pandemic, or world events are very traumatic right now. So there's that. There's also a feeling that news might be written to manipulate a person. So looking for emotion in news that way. And flip side, looking for emotion is maybe helping me know, is this valuable to me or not? Like, do I feel a positive or any emotional response to this piece of news, maybe as a guide to help me understand how to interpret it. And then the third piece of emotion is a very strong fear of sharing misinformation, which is where your project comes in. So a lot of anxiety that a person might accidentally share something and become part of the problem. So that was a big finding this time around, as well as we learned more about specific trust indicators and how to make them more effective.
And so those 8 trust indicators have, I'm assuming, I think I saw, is the report how they've impacted trust in the news, or what
right,
the report you were mentioning was?
Yeah, so there were several. So we did, that was the original research. And then we did a study on, well, right after that, because it was all, as you can see, it was all sort of a logical exercise. It was designed in response to public needs and wants. And so, but we didn't really know whether it would work. So UT Austin, University of Texas at Austin, they have a Center for Media Engagement. They did an A/B analysis with somewhere between 1,100 and 1,200 people. Half saw the trust indicators on the page, half randomly did not. And that's where we saw that there was a statistically significant difference in how people respond to the page and to the journalist. And then the Mirror in the UK did a similar study, except it was live. Before and after they put the trust indicators on their pages, they also got an 8% increase in trust overall in their site. And then there was something like 9 or 10% in the journalist. And then we just recently did a study around the trust mark, which also we have not publicly talked about yet, but essentially we did see a very, I'll say a powerful or at least statistically significant impact of the trust mark itself, that T mark logo, which has certain significance.
What's that significance?
Well, it means that this site has, number one, has all the 8 trust indicators in place, and that they have made a commitment to trustworthy journalism and all the things that the trust indicators signify. So being responsive to the public, being accurate. We have it's kind of a set of commitments that's on our web page. It's yeah. Simply stated, but still it means that they're committed, that if they've made this commitment, they've put the work and effort behind it.
So is it recognizable, like, or is it people are discovering what it is as it, like, have you done any research around like whether people, see the symbol and know what it is, like a copyright symbol? Like, is it a recognizable symbol, or is it more just?
Yeah, we haven't. So we have done research, as I mentioned, just about how they respond to it. Without explanation, like we don't, part of the study isn't like this is what this means. It's just, it's in combination with the trust indicators, and we're learning more. But I think what you're getting at is we haven't done a lot to promote the trust mark itself. Yeah. We've done more to promote the trust indicators, because to me, what we're trying to change the way, help people make more informed decisions about what news to trust. They choose to trust.
So it kind of seems like a tool for media literacy.
Yeah, essentially it is. So it is a tool for media literacy, as well as a tool for news organizations to kind of refine their practices and be more transparent about what is really, who and what is behind this news story. So it works both ways. And that's why we put more emphasis into the trust indicators. But it's true, I mean, as we're speaking, we really should promote that T mark more, especially with our sites. And our sites do, some of them, and I think, let's see, the Toronto Star has done some good work around this, just making people aware, well, what does that mean that we have this trust mark on our pages? And what they had something that they had called the Trust Project before they joined our Trust Project. And so they talk about, well, what does that mean? And what exactly is the Trust Project, both theirs and ours. I think they happen kind of concurrently, which is funny. So yeah, and that was one thing I did want to mention to you. I'm really interested in what you're doing. I think there's a lot of potential for it. And even something, I can see even potential for collaboration there if this ever gets off the ground, if you decide to take it off the ground. But I would ask you not to use the words trust mark, because it has a very specific meaning.
Yeah.
So you can come up with something else that's similar, but isn't this exactly trust mark.
Yeah, well, it does have a name now. Like the site is now check marker, so it can just be the check marker symbol or whatever.
Yeah, like, check mark, right.
Or it might change too. I don't know what it will be, but
okay.
Yeah, sure. I also use the trust indicators for the survey, like to design one of the survey questions. So I'll put.
Well, you can use the trust indicators. I'm happy to have you use the trust indicators. And, as long as you give a mention that comes from the Trust Project, I'm delighted to see that. And part of the reason is that, like you said, we're trying to use these they are a standard. So why not use them in all media literacy type uses, especially because they're prevalent in Canada. Like we've got sites in every province in Canada that are using the trust.
Yeah, and some of these things are like labeling sponsored content or whatever is the law here. But then in other places in the world where it's not, it seems like it makes sort of like unified standards across the world, I guess, or it seems like part of
right. Yeah. And that's exactly what we've been doing. That's one of the ones that's more tricky, is trying to get news organizations in Italy and Spain and Canada and the US, Latin America to agree on what those terms should be. And I mentioned opinion and news, but you're right, like there's a lot more like sponsored content and other kinds of paid, like sponsored links and other kinds of paid content that it's important the public know that that's not regular journalism.
Okay.
Journalism. So yeah, I encourage you to use trust indicators, trust mark, not so much.
Yeah, I can see that. Just talking about trust, do you think that the lack of public trust is a problem that is it a crisis or is it overblown? Like how serious of a problem do you think it is? Has it always been a problem? Like, is it really a new problem? Is it really as dire as some people have made it out to be or not?
Yeah, well, yes, there's always been a problem, and you can point to historical points where it's gotten worse, which are, if you do look at them, it's a bit concerning. But yes, I would say we've been in a crisis around trust in news for at least a few years, and it's the things that have changed are that, like I said, about people are more aware that there's a lot of not trustworthy information out there, but they're not necessarily very good at discerning it, and it makes them afraid of any kind of information. So that's not a good development. If you have people who are, and part of it is because there has been this whole propaganda machine about so-called fake news. So some people think all journalism is somehow fake news, or you can choose what news is not fake or fake, depending on your opinions, or they trust brands, familiar brands, but they're afraid that it might accidentally believe something that's not true. So it creates this whole atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, lack of confidence around within people about their own ability to decide, is this trustworthy, is it not? Should I believe it? Should I make a decision about it, using it? And it's very dangerous, but it's not just dangerous from a democratic perspective, which is, it's extremely dangerous if we can't share enough information to be able to vote on our leadership or vote on policies. it comes down to the very decisions we make about our lives, our own lives, and as we go about our lives. And the pandemic was a really good example of that, but it's not always so dire. And it can be just like, which route do I take to get to school or whatever it is, or community activism and activism writ large. I mean, any kind of activism, whether it means being involved in your church or being involved in all the way through to being involved in a protest. If you have to have information that you can rely upon in order to know everything from where do I show up to what is it this organization really is and does.
And what about like more serious forms of disinformation and media manipulation, like deliberate foreign attacks and stuff like that? How might that be addressed?
How might it be addressed? Well, and how serious is it? I mean, I think it's all very serious. I have read recently that the foreign attacks are less, you probably more up on this, but less common than we might expect. However, we did it depends on what you mean by what type of foreign attack, because we just had that huge one that was unveiled in the US recently. So, but how might they be handled? It's tricky. I think what we need are a lot of different approaches. So you've got governments actually investigating malware. So that's one, and foreign interference and things like elections. So that's one way. Another way is teaching journalists to be better at discerning when they're looking at user-generated content. Is this real? Isn't it real? Or deep fakes, same way. And then you've got what your project, which to me is a wonderful idea, which is bringing the public into fact-checking, because we have all these fact-checking organizations, but bringing the public into the process is a good way. And I think I've seen maybe one or more like that. And then what we're doing, which is journalism itself standing up, getting together and saying, news organizations saying, we're going to be more clear about who we are and what we do and why journalism is distinct and why all the safeguards that are put into journalism to make it trustworthy. So all those things have to happen.
And what do you think is the biggest discrepancy between the media's opinion of itself and the public's opinion of the media? Journalists' opinion of journalism and the public's opinion.
Yeah, I don't know what the biggest discrepancy. I would say that, I don't know. There's a lot of soul searching in journalism to try to understand how do we be more responsive to the public and help the public know our intentions and who and what's behind what we do. There's also some entrenchment still in we are journalism, you should trust us because we're journalism. And to me that doesn't really fly anymore. And there's also, honestly, there's a lot of journalists. I mean, every journalist, I would say, who really is a journalist is out there seeking the truth and reporting on it. And they are under assault at every turn. And so there's a lot of feelings of loneliness and isolation on the part of journalists who are just really courageously trying to report the news and being attacked for it and being vulnerable, especially women journalists, being vulnerable because of its potential attacks on social media or even physical threats. And lots of fields have encountered that. So it's not unique to journalism, but in today's world, we're just seeing such more volatility, and journalism has been a victim of that as well, or a target, let's say, not so much a victim, a target. In terms of public perceptions, what I think a lot of journalists don't know that we found in our research is that there is a very strong desire for reliable information on the part of the public. So people aren't, there are people who are checking out because they are overwhelmed by the news, or like I said, there's too much emotion in their engagement with it. But in general, people recognize the incredible value of just basic reliable information, and particularly journalism, for the different purposes that make journalism so distinct. So accuracy, helping us know about one another, giving us multiple perspectives, just to pick three. Like, and across, we did, in our research, we looked across a lot of different types of people, and we were able to identify 4 user types from the most engaged, highly engaged to the least. And all 4 of them talked about the value of reliable, trustworthy news. There's 2 risks that I see. Like, I love the idea of you involving the public very much. And this is something we've thought about at the Trust Project, is how can we engage the public more in our work? Because as you could see, we started with the public. The idea is to really to put the public front and center in journalism. And so how can we at the Trust Project do more of that? And that's why it's really intriguing what you're doing. One problem is how do you bring people to a space and keep them there? Because it's a lot. I've seen, maybe years ago, I've seen examples of sites that try to do that and aren't successful because they can't keep the population on their site unless it's students, like professors making their classes do it. The other thing today is that you can get a lot of people coming in that are basically just trying to manipulate the system. So how do you protect against that? And you may have already thought about that, but that's like, how do you protect against the trolls, essentially? And then the third thing, which wasn't, maybe you were going to ask me about this, but one thing I noticed when you, like, I looked at the organization of your site from what I could see from the video, and I liked overall the way, the approach you're taking. The issues that you're asking people to highlight, they weren't all factual errors. So that's not, like, strictly speaking, this isn't a fact-checking site exactly. You're designing it more broadly, which I actually really like. And that's why it intrigued me as the Trust Project, because that's the kind of feedback that we're looking for. Not just about facts, but are you feeling like this is, I can't remember now because it's been an hour and a half or something, but what specifically you were asking people to know, but if they felt it was somehow like one-sided or other kinds of things, that's not strictly about facts. That's more about, do you feel the story's not really serving the purpose of journalism? It's just maybe more opinion, let's say, or false in some other, but through its structure, not through the facts that it includes. And then the other thing I was going to highlight for you while I'm on this is I would not use the word alternative fact, because at least in Canada it may be different, but in the US, alternative fact has a certain meaning, and it's historical. It traces back to Trump's spokeswoman saying that, talking about alternative facts.
I think, yeah.
So it's not that, like, that's not a communication that I would think a fact checking wants to convey. Like, it's not that there aren't alternative facts. It is a fact. And so what you may want to offer is additional facts, or ask for additional facts, further facts, facts that contradict whatever the story said. So think about your terminology there.
Well, I think I'll stop using, because I'm using claim review. I think I'm going to start just referring to them as claims. Like, so.
Oh yeah, claims. But, yeah, right. Okay, claims. Good idea. Yeah. So what were your other questions?
What do you think is the biggest threat to trust in terms of technology? Or is there a particular technology or a particular area of technology that you think is?
Well, that's really tough. It's always tough for me to pick a biggest because there's so many, and it's not always technology. It could be just, like I said, people's fear of lack of confidence. That's a big threat, is people's lack of confidence in their own ability to make assessments about whether something's trustworthy or not. And then the influence, which again is not necessarily technology, influence of propagandists trying to persuade people that journalism isn't real or isn't really working in service of the public good. So those are major threats. But in terms of technology, it is the, I mean, a lot of people would say deep fakes. I'm not so sure I agree. I think that is a threat, but more immediately, just the massive flood of and ease of putting misinformation out there. So just the amount of it and the ease that anybody can go out, put out their misinformation or disinformation, and it looks just, and they can copy kind of journalistic, the trappings of journalism, the surface look of journalism. And they're becoming increasingly sophisticated about doing that. So that, again, it's not the technology, it's the people behind the technology there. And technology just makes it easier. Yeah, but I guess you can see, I think more about the other side of the equations, the humans that are affected by the technology. Yeah, and I thought about, you were asking what was the biggest threat, technological threat. I think a lot of it is the algorithms. So the fact that these tech platforms are trying to serve us up news that's of interest to us is really tricky. And what it does is narrow. I'm not talking about the filter bubble exactly. It does create a filter bubble, but it also creates a very distorted news diet overall. So like my news feed, I just find it so, when I look at Google News or any other really, it's so different from what you would get from looking at a news site, because a news site gives you this diversity of kinds of news. It goes deeper into some areas, lighter in others. You can choose, and it's like this may not be the perfect metaphor, but it's kind of like the difference between going into someone's home and they serve you like this wonderful smorgasbord, versus that's the website that's selected for an occasion. That's the news brand site like the Globe and Mail or the Star or CTV News, versus like a vending machine where you've got, these packaged foods in Atlanta, you get what you get. And maybe it's a vending machine that learns your preferences, but it's really not the rich potential of news and information. So to me, that's very risky, because it undermines people's understanding of the world and their own communities. It also undermines their understanding of why it's important to be informed.
Yeah.
I'll have to develop my metaphor, but anyhow.
Where everywhere you go,
good luck.
Everyone everywhere only gives you that one thing because one time you liked it.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's true. Right. You only get Cheez-Its. Nothing but Cheez-Its. I don't know if you have those in Canada.
Wherever you go.
Yeah. Right.